starting live. So go to youtube.kylemhooks.com. That'll redirect you to the page. Hello YouTube. We're live now and we're going to talk about photography. Guys, I appreciate you. Go check it out. I left a comment right there at the top as to where to find me. We're going to say goodbye to Instagram. We're going to say hello to YouTube. Hi. We're going to end the video on Instagram, share it to our story. Alright, so photography. I love photography. It's a great thing. Here's how we're going to do today. So I have my camera. I use a Nikon D500. I just got back from a real estate shoot, so I have my wide lens on it, but photography is photography. I'll change the lens later. Really more observing for myself. But then we also have the view from my camera. So if I take a picture of you, which is really a picture of me with the wrong settings, here we go. Take a picture of you, it's going to show up on our screen over here, which is not a fantastic photo, but it is what it is. This was a last minute idea, so we're going to do last minute ideas. Oh, that's a lot better. Look at that. There's my whole setup in case you ever wanted to see it. And you can tell my monitor is all the way on the other side of the room, so if I have to squint like this, you know why. A bit of water in case we get a dry mouth. Here we go. So, photography. I even have a whiteboard for demonstrating things and a marker. So, what we're going to talk about today is how to do photography in manual mode. And you know what we ought to do? We're going to pull up comments so that we can follow along with things people say. Like if you're complaining about the audio, it may be clipping a little bit. Let's turn that down. So, leave a comment. How's the audio? Because I'm not listening to it. I'm talking to you. I could listen to it. This is super informal, in case you can't tell. But, so the plan is we're going to talk about, a little bit of echo. We're going to talk about how to do photography in manual mode. And I'm pulling up comments right now. We got one person watching. Thank you, one person. Or is that me? Anyways. So, here's the deal. Your camera is a computer strapped to a box. In fact, the word camera is literally Latin for box. So, digital camera is a computer strapped to a box. And when you think about it that way, photography gets so much easier than you might think. So we're going to talk about how to take control of that computer because you were smarter than a computer. You are. You're smarter than the little computer they fit into your box on your camera. So we're going to talk about how to take control of that computer and make it do what you want so that you get the images that you think you see rather than the images that come out when you're in one of the automatic modes. I'll tell you that I normally shoot in a manual mode. It gives you consistency, it gives you control, and once you're used to it, once you've practiced with it, which is the real time suck on it, once you practice with it, you can actually be a little faster than you might otherwise be in an automatic mode. It's not always the case, but I find that probably 4 out of 5 times it's better that I be in manual mode, and I just want to show you how that works. So, first thing to know is that everything in life is a trade-off, and photography is no exception. So you've got 3 different controls, basic controls. There are other controls, but 3 basic controls on your camera in manual mode. And we're going to talk about what each one of those controls does, and we're going to talk about the trade-offs that come along with each control. Now, nothing is bad, nothing is good. It just is what it is, and you want to get the image that you probably have an echo. You want to get the image that you have in your head, not the image that that you don't have in your head. And so there may be trade-offs that you want in a particular case that you don't want in another situation. So for instance, do you want the background to be blurry or do you want it to be sharp? Well, like I said, I just got back from a real estate shoot. I want everything to be sharp. So I'm going to try to make it sharp. I don't want the trade-off of things that would make it blurry. So we're going to talk about how to control the three basic controls. We're going to talk about the trade-offs of each control, setting it high and setting it low, what you give away for that, and that'll be our basic photography class for today. So first control is, I think, the most magical control, and that is the shutter speed. We're going to talk about shutter speed first. Shutter speed is most magical because it is the closest thing humans have ever come to having an actual time machine. Shutter speed is so cool because it is how your camera relates to time, and we measure it as time. So we're going to start an analogy, and we're going to continue it through this whole time, and the analogy is a water spigot, a faucet, if you will. And we're going to imagine that the pipe and the faucet bringing you the water is the camera. The water itself is light, and the bucket that it fills is going to be your picture. So we're going to make a really, really hard effort that will fail miserably at having some sort of a drawing on here, and it may be too bright, but we're going to give it a try. Like I said, I came up with doing this last night, and we'll see how it goes. So it's Haley. Hi, Haley. So we've got I feel bad. Haley's seen this before, many times before. So we've got a faucet, and it has the knob, the valve, if you will, and then there's a pipe, and then we'll have water coming out, and we have a bucket. So in this analogy, your shutter speed is the valve. And the longer you have that valve turned to the open position, the more water is going to come out the spigot or out the faucet. So if you have it only for a short time, only a little bit of water will come out. If you have it open for a long time, lots of water will come out. And so it's like your time machine. It's how your camera relates to time. Now there's some trade-offs. If you have it open for a long time, you'll get a lot of water, which is usually good. But the issue is things move. And so if you have it open for a long time, the things in the frame of the camera that move, they will get blurry. And it won't be because you weren't in focus. It'll be because the things moved while the shutter was open. So let me give an example of that. So we're going to put our camera in manual mode, and we are going to turn our shutter way down. And here's the thing. Not only and we're going to do a selfie because it's the 21st century, that's how we do, right? So not only will your subject move, but your camera will move. You shake a little bit when you hold it. So that was how long an exposure? Well, let's go to our handy computer here. You know what? We didn't meter against over here, did we? I won't be teaching how to do a live stream on manual photography. I haven't figured that out just yet. We're getting there though. So here is the picture we just took. And it was in focus, but I moved, the camera moved. It's nice and bright, but it's not sharp because the camera's moving, I'm moving, because we had a long shutter speed. In fact, you should be able to see the shutter speed was, yeah, that was 1/4 of a second, which to you and me normally doesn't sound like a lot of time, but in the camera, it's a lot of time. And so if we adjust our settings, our other two settings that we're going to talk about shortly, then we can have a shorter shutter speed, something along the lines of 1/80th of a second, and that will give us a properly exposed photo. Actually, we need to be faster. So we're going to do 1/250th of a second, and that will give us a properly exposed photo. Oh, I never switched back to me. Here we go. Here's a properly exposed photo that is sharp because it had a faster shutter speed. And so you can see the trade-off. A faster shutter speed doesn't let in as much light, but it also freezes the motion that's in frame. And most of the time you want that. Most of the time you want a sharp, still image. Sometimes you don't. What if you're... in fact, maybe I can find it while I'm talking. If I can't find it while I'm talking, please forgive me. But what if you are taking pictures of the stars? I'm not even going to try. Let's say you're taking pictures of the stars and you want to see the stars moving. Well, then you're going to have to leave the shutter speed. You're going to have to leave the shutter open for a long time. More than 1/4 of a second, more than a second, more than 10 seconds. How about 30 minutes? That's a really slow shutter speed, and you're leaving the shutter open for a really long time. But you get the motion of the stars. And if you want to show motion, a slow shutter speed is the way to do it. But let's say you're doing sports. You want to freeze that action. You want to, you don't want any motion blur. So speed up your shutter speed. Just be aware that you have to change some other settings on your camera to compensate for that, to let in light other ways. So that shutter speed, that's like your faucet. That's the longer it's open, the more light, or the more water in this case, the more light that it lets through, the longer it's open. That's your first control. Usually, if you're in manual mode, usually that'll be the back wheel. If you just, at least on a Nikon, your top wheel on the Canon, that's what, if you're in manual mode, it'll hit that shutter speed first. And if you're on like a pro, or if you're on a consumer level Nikon, that wheel in manual mode, it only does shutter speed unless you hit a different button to adjust our next control. Our next control is aperture, and we do need another lens for that. Hold on real quick. You know what, we're going to have to deal with that some other way because, well, I've got this right here. Aperture is kind of like the size of the pipe. And if you've got a nice wide pipe, then it will let lots of light in. And if you have a narrow pipe, it won't let as much light in. And that is exactly how aperture works. So we measure in still photography, we measure aperture as a ratio. So in a lens, you have here's the mount. You have the focal length. and the focal length relates to how zoomed in you are, among other things. And then you have, so that's how long the lens is. Then you have the width of the lens element, and the ratio between the size of the aperture, which is what lets light in. In fact, I might be able to show you. The aperture, it moves in and out with your camera settings. Let me see here. You know, if we were doing this in person, it moves in and out with your camera settings. You see it there? And it determines how much light is let in. So your f-stop is a ratio between the width of that aperture and the focal length of the lens. And so you'll see it written on your lens. So I'm going to put it right here. You see it written on the top of the lens there, I hope. 1 to 1 over 8. Let me see. 1 to 1 over 8. That is the maximum aperture of the lens. So the width of that aperture is 1.8 times smaller than the focal length of the lens. Lets in a lot of light. So the smaller that number is, the bigger the hole is. That's the whole point of all that math that you didn't want to do during quarantine. The smaller the number, the bigger the hole, is the simple way to remember that. So if we take this lens and we have a small aperture, so like let's say we set it at f8, it won't let much light in. So we have to control some other things to get a proper exposure, and we're just looking at our light meter on the top of the camera, and we're just going to take a picture of the lens here, of this other lens. We're going to take it at f8. So that means that the focal length is 8 times longer than the aperture is wide on that setting. And you can see there's my lens. That is my Tokina 11 to 16 f2.8 wide angle lens. I love this lens, by the way. And you can see how the numbers in the front are sharp, and the ridges on the inside of the lens hood are also sharp. And you even have some detail out to the edge of the table here. And if I were to back up a little further, I'll bet we can get, here's the keyboard. And this will be a good demonstration of depth of field. And we're going to actually open it up just a bit, f6.5.6. Now we'll leave it at f8 and we'll boost this. Okay. So, oh, I never showed you the lens. Here we go. So here's a good exposure, even if it's crooked, and you can kind of see Logitech on my keyboard. The letters on the lens are sharp. The ridges on the lens hood are sharp, and you can see some detail on my messy desk back there. But let's see what happens when, and you'll notice that my shutter speed was a 20th of a second, so that's kind of slow. You don't want something that slow. So let's see what happens when we open it all the way up to f1.8. And we're going to meter, and I don't know if you know what it looks like, but I'm trying to figure out a way to show you. You see on the top there, on the top of my camera, I keep forgetting to switch. I don't think you can see it, but there's a little meter, and you'll see it as you look through the lens. It'll have a minus on one side, a plus on the other side, and a line in the middle. And if things are too bright, you'll have bars on the right. If things are too dark, you'll have bars on the left toward the minus sign, and if things are just right, you'll be right in the middle at that 0. So let's take a picture. You've already seen what it looks like at f8. Let's take a picture of the same lens at f1.8. And I'm going to try to frame it about the same way, except maybe less crooked. And we'll see how that turned out. You know what, we're going to bump our shutter speed up just a bit. Here we go. So here's what we end up with. There's f1.8, here's f8, and f1.8. They're not framed exactly the same, but you get the picture. That's a definitely intentional pun. If you look at the keys down here, you'll see that they are not sharp at all. They are completely out of focus. But on our f8, you can kind of see the letters, and you can kind of see, you can see Logitech there. Now let's look at the lens. Here the letters on the lens are very sharp. Ridges on that lens hood are very sharp. Now let's look at the one we just took. Those ridges on the lens hood, they're not so sharp anymore. And you can even see where the numbers are not sharp because they're a little further away than this area where I was focusing. And so what does that mean? Part of the way that the lens focuses, let's switch back to our camera. Part of the way that the lens focuses is it uses the size of that hole. In fact, you can create what's called a pinhole lens. Take a butt cap, a body cap for your camera body, and you drill a hole in it, and then you put a piece of tin foil over that hole, and you try to make sure it's in the exact middle, and poke a tiny as you can little hole, and that will actually focus an image for you. Because the smaller a hole is, the more likely it can actually focus an image. In fact, the first cameras, that's all they were, was a tiny little hole and some kind of photosensitive material behind it. And so as you make that hole wider, you're letting in more light, but you're also losing that property of being able to focus an image. So again, it kind of depends on what you're going for. I like this picture better because you can't see my messy desk anymore when it's blurred out, and that's a really highly sought after and frankly makes lenses expensive feature on a lens. This is actually not an expensive lens. It's a Yongnuo 50mm 1.8. It's a fantastic lens. And it's less than $100. I highly recommend it, but not the one you're looking at. The one that I took the picture with. I just realized we're still on that picture. So if you want to blur out the background, one of the ways to do that, it's not the only way to get a blurry background, but one of the most commonly known ways to get a blurry background is to use a wider aperture. And that'll blur out the background. It'll let in more light so you can use a faster shutter speed. There you go. So we have our shutter speed, which is the valve on the faucet. We have our aperture, which we measure in f-stops, and that relates to the size of the pipe. The bigger the hole in your lens, the more light it'll let in. Our camera has disconnected for some reason. So those are two of the three controls for being in manual mode on your camera. The third is a little tricky, and it's a little harder to think about, and it's a control called ISO. And ISO relates to, think about it as the water pressure. So if you have a lot of pressure in the hose, you don't have to open it as long to get more water out. If you have a lot of pressure in the hose, you don't have to have as wide a hose to get water out faster. So think of ISO as the water pressure, and it's not ISO, it's ISO. It's a word, you say it, ISO. And there's some trade-offs. So we measure ISO in hundreds. So a lot of cameras, the lowest ISO you can get is 100. And you know, it'll go up to insane numbers. I think mine will go up to 51,200, which is, I have never used it that high except to see what it looked like, and it was awful. So there's trade-offs with that. The higher your ISO, the more sensitive your sensor is to light. But as with everything, there's a trade-off, and that trade-off is noise. Let me demonstrate. So you noticed that here on this image we took, it was a 1/500th of a second at f1.8, and our ISO was 6400. So let's zoom in on here, and you can see that there's almost like a grainy look to it. But if we were to turn the ISO down, we could make it look a little better. So let's try it at 100. And we're going to turn our shutter speed down as a result. And actually, we're going to try it at 200 because it's deceptively dark in here. And I'm going to try to frame it the exact same way so that you can see the difference. But you also saw how well that worked out last time I tried to do that. Alright, so that was almost the same picture. Oh, we got motion blur because we had to slow our shutter speed down. Let's try this one more time. We'll do it at ISO 400. How about that? And here's a trick. If you have to use a shutter speed, get a lot of shots, and one of them will come out hopefully not blurry. We call that spray and pray. So here is the image that we took at, nope, that's not it. Here's the image we took at 6400, and zoomed out like that you almost can't tell, but if you zoom in you can see that there's a bunch of grain, we call that noise. It's not grain because this isn't film, it's noise. But if we switch to ISO 400, you see that that noise is gone. And if we come to this one that was blurry, but because we moved, because the shutter speed was slower, ISO 200, it's even less. So that's the trade-off. So we're talking about ISO. And that is the pressure through the hose or through the pipe. So here's the way they interact with each other. Here's the way they trade off. Oh, I drew something and I didn't show it to you. So we have our three controls. We have our shutter speed, which is the amount of time you have the valve open. We have our aperture, which is like the size of the pipe. The wider the pipe, the more water. The wider the aperture, the more light. And then we have ISO, which is like the water pressure inside the pipe. The higher the water pressure, the more water, but the more splashing. You know, like when you have a hose and water pressure is high, you know, like you don't water a plant with that because it'll spray water and dirt everywhere. Well, with high ISO, you get noise, which is almost as bad as spraying water and dirt everywhere. So those are your three controls. Here's how they relate. If you want, let's say you want a blurry background. Everybody loves a blurry background. It's way overused. There's other ways to separate your subject from its background, but everybody loves a blurry background. So you know that you want to have a wide aperture. And let's say you're out on a sunny day. Well, that means that you need to turn your ISO down, and you want a low ISO. You almost always want the lowest ISO you can get away with because you want the cleanest image that you can manage. Although I'm going to do a video about a new software I found, Topaz Denoise AI, is so fantastic. Anyways, you want to lower your ISO as low as you can get away with, and if you're outside on a sunny day, you want to make it as low as possible. If you want the blurriest possible background with your aperture, you open that aperture up as much as you can and still have a properly exposed image, which means you need to only have a giant wide pipe, you have the lowest water pressure you can manage, but you still need to only open that shutter, the valve, a little bit. So that means if you have a wide aperture, you're probably going to have a fast shutter speed. That's the trade-off. So what if you want a wide aperture and motion blur on a sunny day when there's lots of light? Well, you may have difficulty achieving that, especially if you don't have any other accessories with your lens, with your camera. You may not be able to achieve that, and that's sad. You may max out or you may have to, even if you max out your shutter speed on your camera, you may have to close that aperture down because you've got your ISO as low as it'll go, you've got your shutter speed as fast as it'll go, and you're still overexposing images. You got to close down that aperture. So other trade-offs. Let's say that you want a dark image. Let's say you want, even if it's bright, you want an image to look dark. Well, then you need to use all of the controls that you can to make the image darker. I'll show you what I mean. So, like, let's say we're going to take an image of the corner here. That's not a very high contrast thing. We'll take an image of our mouse. We'll see, did we like that? We did not like that. We forgot to check our exposure. So we're going to expose it properly. Take a picture of the mouse. And here it is on our screen. But let's say that we want things to be a little darker. Well, we can have a faster shutter speed, so we'll go from 100 to 200. We can stop down our aperture, and we can lower our ISO. And we can have a darker image. And obviously that is what some people would call underexposed, but I don't believe in underexposed. What if you want a dark image of just the blue, ball? Well, then that accomplishes it for you, especially if you get the little marker out of the way. And so you end up with, and let's say you want it just a little brighter, well then you can slow that shutter speed down just a bit. And you'll end up with a bit brighter of an image, but not much. And it'll load here in just a second. So actually, I think that's kind of cool, especially if you're sitting around. So there you have it. That is 3 ways, 3 controls for your camera in manual mode. I would love to meet with you in person and maybe get a group together to teach how to do your specific camera. You could find it on YouTube if you so desire, but that is how we do manual settings. I'm just going to go over it one more time. You have 3 controls. You have the shutter speed. Shutter speed is like the valve on a faucet. The longer amount of time it's open, the more water it lets through. The trade-off is motion blur. If you have a slower shutter speed, you're going to get more motion blur. If you have a longer shutter speed, you're going to get more motion blur. The longer that shutter is open, the more something can move and seem blurry. The shorter the shutter speed, the less light you let in, but the more action you freeze. The next is aperture. Aperture relates to the size of the pipe. The wider the pipe, the more water. So the wider the aperture, the more light. We measure that in f-stops. The lower that number is, the wider that aperture is. The higher the number, the more narrow the aperture. And then finally you have ISO. ISO is kind of like the water pressure in the pipe. And so the more water pressure it is, the more it'll splash. The higher your ISO, the more noise you get in your image. The lower the ISO, you get less water, but you also get less noise. So, or I guess the lower the ISO, you get less light, but you also get less noise. So, there it is. If you have any questions, leave a comment. If you have any thoughts, leave a comment. Maybe subscribe if this was helpful. I am going to start posting to this channel more often. I've got about 3 or 4 videos ready to go. Going to post the first one up tomorrow. It's actually going to be about visiting my dad's and having some fun and just playing at being someone with a camera. So stay tuned for that. I'll look forward to seeing you. God bless you. Thank you, and we'll see you next time. Bye.